Ready?
Yes, I am.
All right, let's get started. Thanks for coming today for the first unmasked talk. I'm discovering new people. But you know even existed. That's amazing. So before introducing our speaker, let me remind you of some of the events that are going to be happening in the last 2 weeks at the center. In this weekend, starting on Friday, so Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we have the Senior Visiting Fellow Conference organized by Heather Douglas with here. The title is Institutions and the Scientific Agenda. It starts on Friday at 9, so go to bed early on Thursday, so that you can come and join us. And it's over on a Sunday around 11, I believe. No. Yeah, something like that. There's only one talk on Sunday morning, a keynote lecture. If you are online and cannot attend in person, you can actually stream and in fact take part of the conference on Zoom. So you can register to the whole conference, go to the website and just register for the event. And we hope to see some of you in person and some of you virtually. All right, and next week we have 2 more talks, which are the last 2 talks of the semester. On Tuesday, Ravit Dodal is going to be giving a lecture. We're looking forward to that. And on Friday, next week, we have the last talk of the semester given by Pamela Reinagel. She is a neuroscientist from UCLA. If you are interested in, and she will be here for 48 hours, she'll come on Thursday. If you're interested in meeting Pamela, please let me know in advance. Actually, let Shoshi know, and Shoshi will make an appointment with Pamela if you're interested in meeting her. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Serife Tekin from University of Texas at San Antonio. Serife is associate professor there, but she's also the director of the Medical Humanities program. It's our 2nd year as director. Also, the University of Texas, she has won many honors. So one of the last, I'll mention the last 2 ones. The Lutcher Brown Distinguished University Professor, which is an annual fellowship also at UTSA. And also last year, she was the Researcher of the Year. She received the Researcher of the Year award for tenure track faculty also at UTSA. She's one of the leading philosopher of psychiatry. In fact, I think it's barely an exaggeration that she has made philosophy of psychiatry a thing. I mean, by her, but it's true. I mean, you know, the amount of energy you dedicated to the field by organizing workshops, by bringing junior people together, by editing collection is actually just outstanding. It's like a model about how to take a small field and turn it into a big thing. And you know, I think that's really quite something. She's edited several important books: the Oxford Handbook of Psychotherapy, the Bloomsbury Companion to Philosophy of Psychiatry, and Extraordinary Science and Psychiatry. And we are all waiting with great impatience for her monograph entitled Reclaiming the Self in Psychiatry, Centering Personal Narratives for Humanist Science, which is under contract with our attention. Hopefully, we'll get very soon. I hope the center has been good for you.
Yes. Thank you, Edward, for that wonderful introduction. And it's really nice to be back at the center 10 years later and kind of give you an update of what I have been thinking about lately, which again is going to be my book project. So I'm going to start by an observation that there's a crisis in psychiatry. And this crisis both is in terms of kind of mental health, the individuals who are influenced by mental disorders, but as well as mental health research. So statistics, these are the stats prior to the pandemic in 2018. The prevalence of mental disorders in the United States was about 18%. So 1 in every 5 adults suffers from some kind of mental disorder. equally kind of paralleling this kind of increased or number of individuals who encounter mental disorders is a parallel crisis in psychopharmacological drug research. For years and years, psychiatry invested a lot in understanding the neuroscientific underpinnings of mental disorders. And because of that, there has been tremendous amount of funding and research, both from the government, but also from private pharmaceutical companies that kind of unpack or that target these neurobiological underpinnings and treat mental disorders. But lately, drug companies have been leaving the industry. In fact, they actually stopped kind of testing new drugs for bipolar disorder, depression, schizophrenia, and so on, partially because drugs turn out to be not as effective as they anticipated. Plus, in the context that they are somewhat effective, they lead to a lot of side effects, and it's just basically not as profitable. So Stephen Hyman, he's the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, has been writing a lot about why the drug revolution stalled. And of course, things got even worse during the pandemic. There has been about 25% increase in the number of people who have been struggling with anxiety and depression, and kind of other erstwhile defenders of neuroscientific research in kind of psychiatry and like optimists, people like, again, the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, Thomas Insel, is like, well, you know what? Neuroscience is not going to give us what we need. We need to turn to artificial intelligence. So, and now that's kind of the new big thing. I have been writing on this kind of very obvious papers about how psychotherapy chatbots actually will not get us to kind of unpack and understand mental disorders. But today, I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about how how did we get here? Why is there a crisis in psychiatry? By kind of starting with kind of thinking about like how knowledge generation actually works in psychiatry. So psychiatry is not a unified discipline. There are multiple kind of processes of knowledge generation that we might call epistemic ritual in Miriam Solomon's terms. But what's underlying all these kind of psychiatric research is the idea that psychiatry is an intervention-oriented science. So if we kind of think of the goals of science as explanation, prediction, and intervention, intervention is the main goal of psychiatric inquiry. So we have multiple kinds of scientific practices, from drug trials to the development of diagnostic manuals like the DSM that kind of categorize mental disorders in ways to further understand, study, and treat them. Another kind of, another source of research comes from clinical practices. Again, these are mostly academic clinicians who do provide treatment to their patients, and they produce knowledge in the forms of case study publications, clinical trials, and so on and so forth. And again, DSM is like kind of the main, authority in those contexts as well. What is severely underappreciated or underutilized is the self-reports of individuals with mental disorders. I started working on self-reports as a naive graduate student because I'm like, oh, like what better way to go to think about depression than reading people who wrote about their depression. And then I realized that wasn't really philosophical, and then it kind of opened a whole can of worms. But then throughout this the last 10-12 years now, there has been a tremendous increase in the number of self-reports that people are now kind of, that's the main thing that people are talking about their experiences. So in this talk, I will kind of make the observation that psychiatry suffers from what I call twin failures. There is neglect of subjectivity on the one hand, and neglect of self-reports on the other hand. And I will use opioid use disorders and overdose epidemic as my example. I will be focusing primarily the DSM-led psychiatry because it has so much scientific and clinical and policy-related authority, but I could have easily given the same kind of talk by looking at other research practices in psychiatry. I will look at why is there resistance for the inclusion of either study of subjectivity or inclusion of patients' reports in psychiatric epistemology and dominant psychiatry. And I will show that those resistance, the resistance is not actually justified from a philosophical and scientific standpoint. And I will propose an alternative model in which we might think about psychiatry as a form of science and still talk about objectivity while we also include patients' reports and perspectives in the process. And I will end with considering some objections. So the DSM-based scientific psychiatry primarily individuates mental disorders by looking at the behavioral symptoms and signs. So these are things that are experienced by first person, but that also require a validation from third person perspective. So if I'm insomniac, you will be able to see that I'm like awake at 3 a.m. at night or something like that. This exclusive focus on behavioral and symptoms and signs was for the interest of doing proper science. But in this process, the kind of subjective experience has been kind of neglected and sidelined as target of research or treatment. And largely this is due to the assumption that once we actually deal with the behavior, we address the behavioral and physiological components of mental disorders, that subjective part will just go away. It was never kind of taught in its own right. But unfortunately, as a lot of clinicians, neuroscientists, and even the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health suggests, these treatments that use symptoms and signs that sideline subjective experience have not been particularly effective. In addition, so this is the reason that these are twin failures is that they are connected but not the same thing. So there are different ways of thinking about subjective experience, and one of the ways in which we can access the subjective experience is by asking people about their experiences. So self-reports are, in some regard necessary, but not sufficient in understanding subjective experiences. So I take patients' self-reports as approximations of subjective experience and point out that they were neglected. And also patients were never systematically included as subjects of research in any form of psychiatric inquiry, except for some local epistemic practices that I will talk about. So what do we actually get from self-reports? So patients are not a homogeneous group. Not everybody is similarly articulate or similarly transparent to themselves, as we know. But from the kind of reading and working with these first-person accounts, several things just come up for us to kind of understand what dimensions of self-reports or self-experience actually can be clinically relevant for the development of effective interventions. So one is what I call orientational challenges. This is basically kind of, what it is likeness of mental disorder experience. How does it exactly feel not being able to get out of bed in the morning? What is that like? Another thing that we learned from these first-person reports is what I have called hyper-narratives. These are kind of, that raw experience of mental disorder, whatever that might be, and how that intersects with other dimensions of people's lives, how it affects relationships or how they're affected by relationships, and so on and so forth. Another thing that we learned from self-reports is how particular forms of diagnoses and treatment have affected the treatment of the individual. So that's what I call the therapeutic impact of diagnosis. But DSM diagnoses or any kind of diagnosis is actually also reflective of kind of it's a cultural representation, and it provides us people with kind of different ways of articulating and thinking about their experiences, which people like Hacking have called the looping effects of psychiatric diagnosis, that I call the reflective impact of diagnosis. How does that exactly affect people's conception of themselves? And also we learn a lot about what worked, what didn't work, like kind of how people have coped with their experiences and with their illnesses. And largely another kind of theme that emerges is that, of course, not every, again, memoir or self-report is identical, but in the moment that the person starts writing about their experiences, it's usually after this kind of experience, series of experience of crisis, they start talking about how they have learned to live with their illnesses, which, you know, I kind of broadly call like flourishing, like with, you know, flourishing withstanding whatever horrible experience that you might have had with the mental disorders. So, however, again, self-reports are severely underutilized, and there are multiple reasons for it that I'm talking about in my book. But I'm going to give you one example in which kind of neglect of self-reports or subjectivity has been extremely harmful, both epistemically and ethically. So this is the overdose epidemic and opioid use disorder. So, you know, I keep talking about how things are bad and they're going to get worse. But again, this is another thing that was already bad and that got worse after the pandemic. So this is a fact sheet published by the White House. They're basically, the stats indicate that more than 104,000 Americans have died, even just in 1 year. And opioid overdose related deaths are expected to increase to 1.2 million in United States and Canada. So broadly, opioids are natural and synthetic chemicals that interact with opioid receptors and they reduce pain. And they can be in a variety of forms. They are prescription pain relievers, synthetic opioids, and heroin. It's very easy to get kind of dependent on them. They create physical dependence in about 4 to 8 weeks. And what makes opioids extremely hard to quit is that there are severe withdrawal symptoms. Like withdrawal symptoms are almost kind of worse than the kind of particular addictive experience itself. So it includes just general pain, cramps, restlessness, anxiety, and very intense cravings. So because of that, this abstinence-based programs, which a lot of addiction treatment kind of is based upon, like the Alcoholics Anonymous, for instance, you're supposed to just like, you know, quit. But abstinence programs don't work as well in the context of opioids because they are very hard to quit. So for that reason, maintenance therapy, which I'm going to talk about, which involves basically patients receiving injectable opioids in a supervised setting, seems to be a lot more effective in helping people address their symptoms. So it's not coincidence that the overdose epidemic is really alarming and awful in United States and Canada, whereas not so much in Europe. Because maintenance therapy comes in kind of like this degree. So this is a continuum of care model, where the idea, the treatment targets how to manage people's withdrawal symptoms. And that involves kind of from, you know, more like heavy, serious drugs to less heavy and less serious drugs. So the first kind of starting point is methadone treatment. And then, you know, that helps people to kind of deal with their withdrawal symptoms. But methadone treatment doesn't always help. In some, when the patient is not responding to methadone treatment, it's actually extremely effective to use heroin injections as a form of managing the withdrawal. So things get a little technical here, and I'm happy to talk more about it in the kind of in the discussion session. But basically, these treatments are generally called opioid agonist treatment, where patients with long-term and treatment refractory opioid use disorder are prescribed injectable heroin. So sometimes this is called heroin-assisted treatment, but heroin is a Schedule 3 drug, and there's a lot of stigma around it. So people are kind of trying to destigmatize it by not calling it heroin-assisted treatment. But so that's the kind of the new word for it is opioid agonist treatment. So it's found to be extremely effective, especially in clinical trials in Europe. So countries like Denmark, Germany, United Kingdom, Netherlands, they all provide heroin-assisted treatment as a form of treatment for addressing opioid use disorder. However, it's illegal, the drug is illegal in US and Canada, which then leads to that being not offered as a form of treatment in the context of United States and Canada. So the only forms of maintenance therapy here available are the methadone treatment, which doesn't always work. So, and the DSM has actually a, you know, fairly, I think, descriptive classification of opioid use disorders in the manual, and they allude to maintenance therapy in that description. So this is what they say. Maintenance therapy involves taking a prescribed agonist medication such as methadone or buprenorphine, and none of the criteria for opioid use disorder have been met for that class of medication. So, and heroin assisted treatment is not even considered an option. So to the extent that maintenance therapy is considered a form of treatment, that only applies to methadone. So Daniel Steele at the University of British Columbia and I have written this paper about how there's no actually scientific and philosophically agreed upon definition of treatment in both philosophy of medicine and in psychiatry, and how DSM's not even considering heroin assessment as a form of treatment is actually kind of unsound for various philosophical and scientific reasons. But for the purposes of this talk today, I want to look at a particular clinical trial that was run in Vancouver called Study to Assess Longer-Term Opioid Medication Effectiveness, SALOME. The overdose numbers had gotten really, really awful in Vancouver, and researchers and clinicians there got a special permission from the government to actually run a heroin-assisted trial. And the results of this study were basically expected, like if you are a European, but groundbreaking in the context of Canada. Oh, by the way, the heroin-assisted treatment is so effective in Europe that one is no longer allowed to run clinical trials because it's also already established as a thing. Looking at patients' reports coming from this study is just kind of indicative of how helpful heroin-assisted treatment has been. So they write how SALOME, this study, gave them their dignity back. There's actually kind of really good work that's done by clinicians and combining first-person experiences of patients, so people kind of track how they were prior to SALOME, during SALOME, and afterwards. So my habit was going wild. I was spending a lot of money on heroin and opioids, all of kinds. Actually, I was giving all of my welfare check to heroin and street drugs, and I just did not have time to do or think about anything else because I was obsessed with getting my next dose and next high. My life is starting to become more manageable, and they talk about how during the study they started gaining weight, they started exercising, they were able to hold jobs, they didn't commit illicit, they didn't commit crimes anymore, and like they just kind of felt more like humans and with dignity, and they don't get as sick. And they just have more stability and sanity. And this there's a lot of negative, again, like stigma about heroin-assisted treatment out there in the media. It's not like people are just given all these drugs to get like super high in a hospital corner. It's supervised depending on the severity of your addiction. The kind of amount is set in advance, and like how much heroin you should be getting, and it's never kind of enough to make you super high, and it's safe, and so on and so forth. So these kinds of injections are the kinds of injections that people who defend harm reduction models to treat addiction work on. And this is a great example for, I think, how to think about psychiatry as an intervention-oriented science where self-reports, scientific practices, and clinical practices are all aligned in kind of addressing these severe mental disorders and so on and so forth. So then after this study, of course, we will talk a little bit about the kind of ethics of involving patients in research, but just like a lot of clinical trials, researchers run the clinical trial and leave. After the study, heroin was still illegal to be used. It was not available as a form of treatment. So of course, it was extremely hard for patients who benefited highly from this study and from this treatment. So they actually formed their own peer group of previous participants of the study to start kind of writing and thinking and researching and publishing about their experiences with and after the study. And it produced really kind of, important set of data in the sense that they were able to kind of compare prior to SALOME, during SALOME, and after SALOME. And they actually, as a group, did a constitutional challenge to Supreme Court asking them, allowing to receive the OAT, heroin-assisted treatment, as they kind of move forward. And they're also heavily involved in advocating for the necessity of the immediate establishment of more harm reduction kind of models in Canada. But again, this is an example of what we lose perhaps when we do not engage with the kind of self-reports of individuals with mental disorders in understanding and treating mental disorders. So then this was a quick example to show you how twin failures of psychiatry have harmful epistemic and ethical consequences. Or basically, I mean, this is a very kind of, whenever I teach medical ethics, I kind of, talk about like harming the patient or withholding available treatments for patients and stuff. And this is a perfect example of this. People are dying from overdose, and there is a more effective than others method of treatment, but we are not even thinking about that. So you might ask, okay, so where does psychiatrists stand in all of this? Like, are they actually open to kind of making subjectivity more of an explicit research target, and perhaps including patients in psychiatric research projects? So I go back and forth between being very pessimistic about the state of affairs and being very optimistic about the state of affairs. So this history is rather complex. So briefly, DSM, or at least the American Psychiatric Association, is very reluctant and resistant to the idea of engaging with subjectivity or self-reports, because anything that you say about the self, subjectivity, self-reports, whatever, remind them of psychoanalysis, and they are allergic to psychoanalysis because there has been so much controversy about establishing psychiatry as proper science, and that was the reason that there was a move away from psychoanalytic frameworks of understanding mental disorders in the 1950s and 60s. So this is like a very, very broad history of how things kind of came forward. So in 1952, when the DSM-I was first published, it was primarily a statistical document actually to keep track of who is fit enough to go to Korean War. And at the time, the most dominant scientific framework for thinking about mental disorders was psychoanalysis. But there was, of course, a lot of controversy about whether psychoanalysis is actually true science or not. And we have the works of Popper, Grunbaum, Karl Hempel, kind of the forerunners of logical positivists not really being fans of the idea. And there's a kind of a controversial history that American Psychiatric Association was influenced by logical positivism, but there was also a lot of other things going on at the same time. Medical model of disease was on the rise. Psychiatrists at Washington University in St. Louis were trying to find objective markers of studying mental disorders. So they were running these longitudinal studies on grief and depression to distinguish whether or not grief is the same as depression and so on. So there was this kind of move away from psychoanalysis to behavioral signs and symptoms. And then starting with the DSM-III, we moved to that behavioral and symptomatic language in talking about mental disorders, so behaviorism was kind of the king. Of course, it's like the best competitor to psychoanalysis at the time, but there was also a lot of optimism that we will be able to match those behaviors with their neuroscientific underpinnings. So as I kind of pointed out in my crisis slide, now there's that kind of disappointment with neuroscience and move to artificial intelligence and so on. So you can actually read this particular history as a map of that crisis slide that I first showed. In the meantime, what I think is really puzzling is there was cognitive revolution as a wonderful alternative and middle ground, perhaps the extremes of psychoanalysis and behaviorism. But for some reason, psychiatry did not really engage with the kind of these fundamental research programs in cognitive revolution that understood the complexity of the human mind. And my kind of call for returning to the self or thinking about the self in the context of mental disorders is in a way kind of picking up some of the work that left unfinished in cognitive revolution and carrying it to the context of psychiatry. So in the spirit of this, is there any hope for things to change? Prior to the publication of the DSM-5, 5.0 because DSM 5.1 was just published last week. So prior to this, so this is in about 2010, which was when the DSM-5 was scheduled to be published. That year, there was an increasing number of calls to the APA saying, listen, we need to include patients and their families in the diagnostic manual creation process. And this came actually both from clinicians and psychiatrists and patient advocacy groups, as well as philosophers. And this was, in fact, the year, that decade where Occupy movement was big. In fact, in the 2010 meeting, which was held at in San Francisco, patients kind of created this Occupy APA protest. All of these arguments were primarily based upon, or inclusion of patients. The demand for that was for social and political reasons. There was this argument that democracy requires all stakeholders to be part of the decision-making process. Patients and their families are stakeholders. That's why we should include them in the decision-making process. So it was primary. The focus was, social and political reasons, not necessarily epistemic reasons, which is kind of my argument that we have to include patients for epistemic reasons. So the APA task force have actually, at least this might have been a PR thing, but they seemed at least open to the idea of a more public engagement of the DSM, but they never actually singled out and invited patients to give feedback on the DSM, but they invited them as on the virtue of the fact that they are members of the public. So they opened basically the DSM 5.0 draft as for public commentary, and people have provided them public comments. They never published exactly how those that public feedback was utilized or kind of incorporated, but then they did provide a press release and an article that talks about how public feedback for the DSM-5 was part of the crucial experience. They were resistant to including patients and only patients in the process for what I think is epistemic reasons. So when there were all these calls to invite patients to the board, all these papers were published. Some of them were published by psychiatrists within the APA. So the task force actually wrote an official response for why they are not including patient subjective data in the DSM and ICD. And here they cite, I think, purely scientific reasons, where they say, by definition, subjectivity is variable from person to person, therefore making it impossible to develop objective criteria that would apply to every disorder. Further, it raises the question of whose subjective experience will serve as a template by which criteria would be developed. So you might think, as a philosopher of science, that there are detailed descriptions of what objectivity or subjectivity might mean, because it means so many different things, in the context of science. But there is none of that. It's underdeveloped, and this is a very, very short paper, and this is the primary reason that they provide for not including patients. And I think it shows and illustrates a lot of the assumptions made about what objectivity is and what being scientific means. So I think there are remnants of logical positivism in this reasoning, where where objectivity is thought of as the outcome of scientific inquiry, and justification for evidence is observational data, which kind of is in the form of signs and symptoms. We can provide this third-person observations about people's behavior. So that worry about whose subjective experience we'll consider is, seems to be motivated by that worry. A great philosopher, Heather Douglas, has written on how complex the notion of objectivity is and how it's used in different ways that none of them kind of match onto one another. They're all different senses of objectivity. So I think the kind of objectivity that they were seeking here is detached objectivity and value neutrality and so on and so forth. So the other thing that happens in the DSMs is when you read the introduction of all the DSMs, there is a lot of appeal to how this process was scientific. And the kind of measure of scientificity is the consultation with experts. Experts play a very, very important role in all these DSMs. Like if you actually do a word search, like you'll see all the expert language in the kind of in the introduction. But by experts, they mean primarily technical experts, individuals who are trained in psychopathology. But if we adopt a different framework, like scholars in science and technology studies say, we might think about patients also as kind of experts, which I will talk about in a minute. So in that sense, like patient objective knowledge was equated with expert knowledge. So that the takeaway is this: DSM does not seem to be willing to invite patients or think about subjectivity as a research target by citing scientific reasons. But I think it's misguided, because if our goal is to do science, we have to think about the goals of inquiry, and the goals of inquiry in psychiatry is intervention. So we have to take that kind of scientific, that reality seriously if we want to think about science. And I'm going to show how we can frame psychiatry being scientific in another way, and another way of thinking about objectivity that is not like their account of objectivity. So here in this view, I argue that patients must participate in scientific psychiatry for epistemic reasons. Their inclusion and interaction with other experts is necessary for objectivity. And this process does not focus on objectivity as an outcome of scientific inquiry, but rather it focuses on the process in which we do science. It's intrinsically value-laden and interactive, and these are all great things. So the background for this kind of framework is coming from feminist epistemology and feminist philosophy of science. We have scholars like Lorraine Code, who talked about epistemic implications of our social occasions. In particular, her focus was gender, how failure to account for women's experiences has resulted with androcentric assumptions. In Harding's words, it was bad for science that we did that, right? And we have scholars talking about expertise in different ways, that expertise is also a complex and rich concept, and those qualified by degrees are not the only experts. We can kind of think about experts who are being qualified to be experts on the basis of their experiences. And there are epistemic implications of patients' conditions. So Rachel Ankeny, for instance, talks a lot about how even in publishing clinical case studies, there might be a way to include also patients' own perspective and experiences in that kind of document in the published article. And I have been talking about how what patients report might provide us kind of evidence that might be overlooked in conventional settings, because in conventional settings we have already questions in mind, and that's what we are asking, as opposed to kind of maybe things coming from patients that we don't have in our framework yet. But I think the challenge of the DSM, or the challenge that's put by the APA, like whose subjective experience we'll consider, is a totally legitimate and important challenge that we need to address if we're talking about an alternative picture of objectivity. And here, I think the best perhaps is to think about psychiatric science as social knowledge following Longino. So then objectivity is a feature of scientific process. It's not the opposite of subjectivity, as Heather points out. And as Alison Wiley says, far from automatically compromising the knowledge produced, objectivity may be substantially improved by the non-neutrality of the knower. So then this is my little dream world. This is how it looks. So this is how we're going to do science. We're going to kind of expand perhaps our notion of experts and kind of take the first person reports as kind of fundamental building blocks of psychiatric knowledge, but they're not going to be the only ones, right? They will have to engage with scientists and clinicians who are technical experts. But here, the conditions of these interactions are very, very important. So again, I take Longino's view of transformative criticism and focus on procedural objectivity as a background. But unlike her, I mean, she may be reluctant to grant patients the status of being scientists, because she's coming from a place where we need a diverse group of scientists. But I think it can be expanded to include patients, but we have to kind of pay attention and try to create venues and values to conduct this kind of work. So there has to be avenues for criticism, meaning patients and other experts have to come together at conferences or publish papers, peer review each other's work. That's going to be an intrinsic part of this process. There has to be a kind of a shared intellectual understanding of intellectual authority. People should be able to trust each other that the other group or other party has something meaningful and important to say. So trust is very important. And I think a lot of damage has to be addressed before we move on there, because there's a big kind of antagonism between psychiatrists in the abstracts and patients. And some patients actually call themselves survivors, not survivors of mental illness, but survivors of the psychiatric system. But that's a very important component. All the participants of this research process has to respect each other. They have to be open to criticism. Again, I don't know how this will play out, because psychiatrists sometimes get too defensive and patients get too defensive. So it's a whole mess. So nobody has automatic privilege. Me being a patient or being a researcher does not grant me that automatic expertise status. And we should also pay attention to there not being a tokenism. I can easily see where a token member of patient brought to the board and represented as like, see, we engage patients. And this is just like, having a token woman in a committee or a token Black person in like somewhere. So we should not be doing that. Okay, so again, kind of coming back to pessimism and optimism, is there hope that something like this will actually happen? Like how is this supposed to kind of work out in practice? I'm less optimistic about the American Psychiatric Association's willingness to engage with patients, but a little bit more optimistic about the National Institute of Mental Health. So that National Institute of Mental Health proposed a few years ago, well, in 2013, actually 9 years ago, a framework for studying, understanding, conducting research on mental disorders that is grounded on this like matrix. And part of the important information that's important for the matrix is self-reports. So there is actually an explicit place where they want to consult self-reports, but it's unclear how it's supposed to pan out. There hasn't been a lot of research on that dimension of the matrix. And my worry is that by self-reports, if they mean just surveying patients, we may not go to the points that I want to go to, because kind of this open-ended things coming from patients generated by them also seems to be an important part of the process. In other domains, maybe there's a little bit more optimism. So there's patient-centered research initiative that funds a lot of projects. And some of my colleagues at University of Texas Health, their oral nursing faculty, they have invited me to be part of this stakeholder alliance for Alzheimer's patients. So this group basically involves clinicians, researchers, patients and their family members. Our meetings are once a month. We read a paper, we talk. So it's just kind of, this little group. There's always cake, there's conversation. And the goal is to kind of, see what patients are experiencing, what family members are experiencing, and kind of produce stuff based on those. I'm also collaborating with a number of psychologists who are at the VA, and San Antonio being a big military city, we have actually a lot of veterans who have substance use disorder or traumatic brain injury and so on and so forth. And the Department of Defense is very, very invested in kind of alleviating the burdens of disease in this population. So, and they have been actually encouraging this kind of patient engaged research in those kinds of process. So there are these like little local pockets. Interestingly, all this stuff actually, I was very happy when the pandemic started, I have to admit, because here we have this complex condition that nobody has any idea about. And the only place to turn to understand how COVID affects people is people's self-reports. Like maybe self-reports will actually be popular. Maybe this is a moment. And interestingly, a patient group in the UK who had like people with smell loss experiences and so on, started getting a lot of demand from after the pandemic from people who have lost their sense of smell because of COVID. And they ended up actually, starting a research program by creating a Facebook page, and people were reporting about their kind of disorientation when they have like lost their sense of smell. And they collaborated with philosophers and researchers like Barry Smith to talk about what we actually learn and so on. And again, initially, smell loss was not taken to be a serious condition because, there was more, important problems in the sense that you could die. But, after a while, with all of this research and engagement and so on, people actually, researchers and clinicians started paying more attention. So perhaps kind of so in other words, even in other fields of medicine, there seems to be a turn to patient self-reports and so on. I think perhaps that's a way to, that's a reason to be optimistic. So the takeaway here is that my view of participatory interactive objectivity does fit the goals of inquiry in psychiatry, in that we arrive at clinically relevant phenomena that will help us develop effective interventions. There are obvious objections to this, right? So one might say, well, look, you have granted so much autonomy and agency to people with mental illness. Don't we know that mentally ill patients lack rationality? No, actually, we don't know that. There's no conclusive data that supports that across the board. In fact, there is a series of research that shows patients are capable of rational decision making. But of course, we have to think about limited epistemic agency. It does happen, but mental illnesses do not necessarily nor universally interrupt epistemic agency. And not all conditions create impairments, or they don't create impairments consistently. And if they do, there can come in varying degrees of severity and transiency. And we can take this into account. And again, remember, my view is not just to go with whatever patients report, right? But rather kind of integrate them in this cycle by using selection criteria, engaging in transformative criticism, and kind of getting them participate in this conversation alongside with clinicians and scientists. Another, I think, great objection is self-reports are not reliable. Don't we know that from philosophers and social psychologists that self-reports about causal actions are often mistaken? Even some philosophers of psychiatry actually have resisted the idea that we can learn a lot about the experience of depression by reading people's self-reports. Jennifer Radin and Somo Varga wrote that autobiographical writing, by just kind of the virtue of wanting to convince an audience, is not actually going to give us the raw experience of depression, right? These are definitely legitimate concerns, but there is actually no, again, significant body of empirical evidence to support a general dismissal of self-reports in the context of psychiatry. I think if people are concerned about this, we need to study it and then find out what actually comes out. And again, even if there are these kind of potential problems, we can also turn to other areas of cognitive science, like perception research, where a wide variety of experimental fields rely on self-reports in vision, in smell loss, and so on and so forth. And again, I'm not saying using any self-reports as kind of the one and all source of information, but rather incorporating that into our interactive participatory project. So I'm going to end with an example. Maybe this is a helpful note, maybe not. I don't know. I can't decide. But when we look at the kind of important moments of positive change in the history of psychiatry, like the removal of homosexuality from the DSM, it's thanks to this kind of alliance and maybe trust between people who are influenced by the diagnostic systems and people who were decision makers. So Dr. John Fryer was a gay psychiatrist in Philadelphia who kept losing his job on the grounds that he was gay. And this because in the DSM-II, homosexuality was considered an illness. And in the 1972 APA meeting, again in San Francisco, he actually wore a mask and talked about his experiences as a gay psychiatrist. And it was thanks to him, activists like him and other gay psychiatrists within the APA, that somehow managed to convince the board to kind of remove that. And I think very important here is, I'm not really sure if Dr. Fryer was was not psychiatrist. I don't know if it had the same impact that talk, but I think other clinicians were perhaps like more willing to trust him because he was also a psychiatrist than the first person report of another gay activist. But there was this kind of mutual understanding of this, like, oh, okay, we shared intellectual authority in this, and that generated change. So then the takeaway to conclude is the cited scientific reasons for not including patients or not thinking about subjectivity in the context of psychiatric research or psychiatric epistemologies is ungrounded. It is possible to develop, what I call the trilateral strategy that engages with scientific practices, clinical practices, and self-reports. And I'd like to think that philosophers in philosophy or philosophers of science have very important roles to play in reimagining this, just like when feminist epistemologists and philosophers of science started questioning the kind of general assumptions of general philosophy of science. And thank you.
1 minute break, and then we'll have time for questions.
After it gets the first, after it jumps over the first, the arguments of the day.
Repeat the question. I know it. We'll see if I can. If I can do the know-how.
Yeah.
Thank you. Was it good? I didn't forget English. No, you were so good at English. I was very good at English.
Is the reports that you mentioned that they don't even read these things and they can't.
I don't know if they serious. You're not like, I think it went wrong. That went so well. I love it. I don't think it. They're like colorful. Yeah. Some people awesome. So too. Maybe now people know this is the book, right? Like, yeah.
I was like emotional.
You were?
Yeah, I was like.
And I did not swear. You didn't swear. I did not swear. And I wasn't even that mean to the APA. I regularly regarded their concerns as legitimate concerns. That's not how we do science anymore, APA. I was in full swap.
There was so much.
I can't pronounce the names of the opioids, so that's why I kept saying I can't say diacetylamorphine or whatever. That's a hard word.
Are you doing good?
What did you do?
It could be a really, yes. It's one of the. Thank you.
Everyone. All right, let's get going. If you have questions, John, why don't you start?
Thanks, Serife. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
So it seems like there might be two independent ideas or takeaways from the talk, and I'm wondering the extent to which they are really one or separate. So on the one hand, you made the case for paying attention to patient self-reports and subjectivity in research and the DSM process. And on the other hand, the little ladder at the top, you focused on participatory research and patients being equal co-producers of that knowledge and involved in the DSM revision process. And so, I think you can have a process that was participatory but not focused on subjectivity and self-reports by, for instance, just including patients when you're trying to define the research agenda, or as you suggested, being part of the political political agenda for the DSM revisions. And equally, you could have an important heavy focus on research that collects patient self-reports, that engages their subjectivity by doing qualitative research and so on, but in ways that might not be that participatory. I think you kind of mentioned this. You just sent out a survey asking people to count up, to check off which symptoms of a list they were experiencing. That would be a kind of self-report research, but that wasn't participatory. So my question is sort of, in what sense are these two things really that linked? Are you advocating two theses here, or do you see these as being really important that they're traveling together for the purpose of the overall argument?
That's a great question, John, and that's very incisive. So the question is whether we can separate research that engages with self-reports from research that is participatory, or whether or not I think that they ought to happen simultaneously. I think we can definitely imagine them to be separate, and I think perhaps I didn't really kind of construe that in that kind of distinct way, but that's actually very helpful. That I think I would kind of respond to that, or think about that as I'm working more on the book. I think in an ideal world, we have both, right? Because I think just self-reports based research could create us like a lot of different kinds of important helpful knowledge to intervene on mental disorders, while on the other hand, like we can kind of do participatory research, not just kind of thinking about maybe epistemic issues, but also other like ethical, social, political related issues and so on. And I have no problem with them being separate, but one worry I have is if we just do the self-report based, and the kind of self-report based research will be really, really important there. Again, if you're only doing surveys, I mean, I think surveys are great, we should do them, but if we should not just claim that surveys is what, are sufficient to give us what we might need. And in that sense, kind of actively engaging with patients would be really, really helpful. And I think my desire for patient engagement or patient participation is also kind of address some of the perhaps like this, horrendous history that kind of led to a lot of antagonism and distrust in the patient community to psychiatry and so on. I mean, some people do need psychiatric help, do need mental, do need help, but they're disappointed that they don't actually seek treatments in that traditional sense, but they can be separate.
Yeah, so thank you, that was super depressing about
Great, I have achieved my goal.
The thing that would really help, but we just kept it illegal, right? Wonderful.
Yeah, and that's you and Nixon.
Yeah, Nixon. But I was wondering whether or not that's actually a good case for you.
Good, that's a great, yeah.
Because it seems like in that case, the scientific literature, especially from Europe, they won't even let you do the clinical trials anymore because it's unethical. The clinical reports and the patient reports are all lining up together. And it seems like the only thing blocking us from sensible action are dumb political taboos that we need to get over, right? And I'm just not sure, like, science isn't so great at helping us get over these things. Maybe John Oliver will be better at it with his,
I know, yeah.
thing on overdosing.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if there are cases that might be better where there's still, genuine disagreement between the research community on like what are promising avenues for research and patient self-reports that are trying to say like, no, look, your drugs are not working. They're screwing up our lives, and the clinicians are sort of just trying to muddle through. And I wonder if that kind of case might actually show the need for the participatory research that you want to see happen.
That's a really, really wonderful and helpful question. Actually, as I was kind of I submitted, like, I thought about like just talking about opioid use disorder. I'm like, well, this is actually a perfect example of where I think clinicians kind of align with patients on the one hand, but on the other hand, once they stopped the research, you know, patients were kind of left out in the field and whatever. And perhaps if the process was actually a lot more participatory, then perhaps, you know, different outcomes could have happened, but there are also all these like legal issues, as you pointed out. I have multiple examples in my book. So I actually look at alcoholism and alcohol addiction. Some harm reduction models, again, are very popular, and they seem the maintenance therapy seems to be effective, but there's, again, like, as in drinking once a week kind of, right? Whereas like the kind of traditional understanding of, you know, addiction treatment is like pure abstinence. So there are examples like that. And my other example is post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. So, and in those contexts, clinicians and patients are not fully aligned. And I think it will be really interesting for, to look further into the communities where drugs have been disappointing and have led to a lot of side effects and so on and so forth. But that's a great point that I'm going to think about.
Hi, so I have a general question, but I'll get at it by way of the heroin assisted study. So you described that as a case where something showing what we lose by not paying attention to subjective self-reports. But I was thinking, even if we ran that same study, did the same intervention and ignored the self-reports, wouldn't we still see the effectiveness through the behavioral criteria that you were mentioning, like the less crime, less being able to hold a job and so on? And so basically my general question is, with respect to evaluating the success of interventions, doesn't subjective experience depend on having some unique epistemic value? Doesn't it depend on separability from that behavioral things? Otherwise, I'm not sure what it uniquely gives us that we wouldn't have gotten just by saying, oh, look, these people are holding jobs better.
That's a very good question. So the question is, I forgot to repeat this question, but I'm going to repeat this one. The question is, like, without even the self-reports of people who are part of the Salome study, aren't the changes in their behaviors significant enough for us to kind of take that as progress in the context of understanding or treatment of opioid use disorders? So if you look at the OUD diagnostic criteria, there is a little bit of this kind of, you know, diminishing of the quality of interpersonal relationships, being overoccupied with drug consumption. There are markers there, but there are some things that come from patients' reports that are not represented as behavioral signs and symptoms, even though one could say, well, we can really track this, right? I mean, that's the other kind of aspect, I think, in the kind of DSM's like lack of engagement with like subjectivity or any kind of, you know, self-related phenomena. We can measure someone's race, gender, age, like all the other social determinants of like mental disorder stuff, but they're not clearly articulated as ways to kind of enter and understand the phenomena in the DSM. But I mean, maybe that's the kind of a property of even the behavioral signs and symptoms not being displayed and depicted as well in the DSM. But that's a great question.
Thank you very much. So my question is, based on my very small experience in interviewing people, I would say that there is a problem with experienced self-reports, that they depend on questions that people are asked. And on the one hand, the content of subjective experience can be potentially infinite. You can ask questions and questions and questions, and it's endless. And some of these answers are irrelevant. And then you have a problem of how to sort out which answers are relevant and which are irrelevant. And the other problem is that the content is also potentially zero, meaning that if there is no question, people just don't know what to say. And so I would say that the issue of questions is also is quite important in your context, especially in relation to, I guess, objection two that you mentioned. So my question, I think, is whether there is any effort put into this issue of questions, something like a logic and epistemology of questions that people are asked in the literature that you contribute to, or perhaps it's not a problem. I mean, my thought is that perhaps in your context, because my context was completely different, perhaps in your context, in case of mental health, it's just not a problem. I mean, the context in which the person is located perhaps sets up what we want to know and what the person is expected to say. So there is no issue of question. So what would you say?
That's a great question, Conrad. And the question is, are there, I guess it's a big question, but one part is, are there contexts in psychiatry that looks at kind of what comes out of surveys? Because in some sense, sometimes we don't really know what we experience or understand without questions themselves. So unfortunately, a lot of investment and funding has gone to, you know, biological underpinnings and other phenomena that we don't really have sufficient data to kind of talk about what even the kind of survey questions, how they might shape like one's cognition and so on and so forth. And I think this is a very important concern in another sense. So in the context of the smell loss, for instance, what happened was people were experiencing smell loss and they don't have a sense of taste. They start actually kind of smelling, there's anosmia, no smell, and there's like parosmia, they are smelling really, really bad things and the typically like very like beautiful smelling things. They were talking about this confusion, disorientation, they can't relate to their own children because their children smell really bad all of a sudden. So they were really distraught by all of this experience that when this Facebook group started, people were just like, does anybody else have this? Does anybody have, so it's just kind of open-ended, like no research. And then based on those reports, scientists were like, oh, maybe we can do a study on this, or maybe we can create our inventory this way, and so on and so forth. It's a little bit more challenging in the context of mental disorders because so much of our experience of mental disorder, I think, is shaped by what we already know about mental disorder. I mean, how many, like there's so much of Googling one's symptoms. I mean, my students, like I'm very ADHD today. I mean, this is like part of our regular vocabulary now. I'm like, what does that mean, right? Because you being ADHD does not mean anything to me. Like, describe, and then some of that. So I wrote about this. I refer to this hyponarrativity, as in where patients' own descriptions and articulations of their experiences is severely shaped by the medical or the scientific language that is no longer kind of giving us the information that we need, other than being high or being low in the context of bipolar disorder. And you know, you see this in some memoirs and so on. They don't really learn much. So I think, again, remedy is to trying to do all these at the same time. And again, I think my kind of point about like this not being the only source of knowledge or only source of information is a really important one, because I think we can be misguided even in describing our own experiences.
Yes, as someone who knows very little about psychiatry and even less about philosophy of psychiatry, I must say I'm terribly confused by everything you said, because my kind of very naive layperson's view of psychiatry is that it's all about subjective experience. And that you have a mental disorder, well, mental, doesn't that by definition refer to all the experiences that people go through? And therefore, to treat a mental disorder isn't that measured in a way by asking a person in a very general sense, are you feeling better, right? And the idea I have of going to a psychiatrist is you sit on a couch and you talk for hours about the most subjective things that could possibly be. Now, that related to the clinical aspect as well, that aren't many clinical trials also measured in terms of how the patients feel. So are you feeling more pain or less pain? Are you feeling better or worse? And then much more refined versions of this. And even many of the behavioral criteria, I would imagine, are so strongly correlated with feelings that we just take them as proxies for the actual feelings. So I'm wondering whether your view is focus on the quantitative side, like sure, all those issues are already part of the practice, but it's not enough. And the methods by which they are, so the methods by which subjective experiences make it into the research are just too limited and too constrained? Or is there also a substantial qualitative criticism that the way in which subjective experiences plays a role in psychiatry, in this particular picture that I just painted, is too limited? There should be an entirely different way in which subjective experiences enters, which might even go against focuses or emphasis on behavioral criteria, for example. So there's a tension between.
That's a great question. So the question is, well, in the kind of naive observation about like mental disorders and psychiatry isn't actually just all about the self and kind of making the self the person better and attending to their subjective realities and so on and so forth. Like, what is this picture that I'm drawing referring to really? Is it not done well or not done enough and so on? So there's a huge gap or huge break between academic scientific psychiatry and clinical psychiatry, and then social work, clinical psychology all together. So a lot of my criticisms that I just kind of presented today are also, for instance, a lot of clinical psychologists or psychologists' criticisms of American Psychiatric Association as well. And one of the reasons that I kind of started with these like being different epistemic rituals is also to point out there are also different clinical rituals as well. Like a social works dealing with a patient who have opioid use disorder is radically different, or can be radically different from the clinical psychiatrists. And that's all radically different from like research psychiatry. So research psychiatry primarily refers to kind of the DSM-based psychiatry. And a lot of clinicians actually also do not necessarily feel that the phenomena that they are dealing with are not sufficiently represented in this, in the diagnostic criteria or other research priorities and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I think one way, so the concepts like self and subjectivity are very prevalent in these clinical practices. I have a paper about this, whereas why is it not receiving the kind of uptake that it deserves in academic research psychiatric context? And that's precisely why I think we should think about these concepts as targets, research targets on their own, and receive funding to study them, right? And that becomes a kind of big crunch point where clinicians, even clinical studies on psychosocial determinants of mental health are not necessarily being funded. I'm a member of the Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry. When the National Institute of Mental Health published our doc, they sent a representative to give a keynote at the conference. I was organizing that conference. And one of the questions was, so if you want to get NIMH funding, you now have to present your study in terms of RDoC criteria, and that's primarily neuroscientific and genetic research. So one clinician in the audience asked, so if I want to study homelessness and addiction, I can't get funded? And the representative said, yes, you can, as long as you provide also the neurobiological markers, right? And yes, that's like, it's actually in print. I think Katie Tabb wrote about that conversation in a footnote somewhere, and it's also somewhere on Twitter, like it's all public. So this really actually happened, right? So, and that's kind of like my push, because I think there's this assumption that we can't be real scientists if we are studying this phenomena, but that's just, not true if you know a little bit of cognitive science.
You have 8 minutes and 3 questions.
Great, thanks. So many questions, but let me go this direction. So in your, what you call the twin failures,
Yeah.
right? Ignoring subjectivity and self-report. So a cautionary tale here might be that in the late 70s, the International Association for the Study of Pain basically tried to address those twin failures in pain treatment by introducing a subjective element and telling physicians to take patient reports seriously. So those two things are right there in that definition of pain. And sort of two things fall out of that. One of which is then becomes the question of how to systematize these reports. So that's come up in a lot of previous questions. So part of the question I have for you is, how do you actually use all this self-report in a systematic way that then lets you sort of complete this triangle in a way that actually builds something replicable, perhaps. But the other side of this is one might argue that it's this turn towards more subjective criteria for assessing pain that actually is not, of course, the whole clause, but a driver for what becomes the opioid crisis, right? Because previously, doctors were looking at patients going, well, you're not really hurt. I can't find any physical basis for this. I'm not going to give you anything. Now they're told to take these reports seriously, and the opioids come along, and there's also a sort of commercial driver then for that, which is a large part of the crisis, of course, right? Which makes it easy to say, oh, we're doing what we've been told to do here, right? We're satisfying the patient's demand for the reduction of these self-reported pain levels, right? So how do you deal with the systematization and the exclusion, perhaps, of reports that are actually going to lead to harmful outcomes?
That's a great question, and I think that's very helpful for me to turn to pain literature to look a little bit deeper into kind of similarities. So there are actually currently attempts to engage better with self-reports and integrate them. Big line of research is in personality disorders. So the DSM criteria for mental disorders is categorical. You either have it or don't have it. And there has been a big push in the DSM 5.0 to actually make at least the personality disorders dimensional so that you can have degrees. And a lot of psychologists like Leanne Clark, Bob Kruger, and so on, and Ken Schaffner actually was really involved in these conversations as well. They were really pushing for a kind of a dimensional model. And this is, perhaps anecdotal, but I heard that the APA in the end didn't like the emphasis on selfness and subjectivity, cited Freud. We don't do that anymore. And it didn't actually make it in the last minute to that. But I think personality disorders is one category that these researchers and psychologists who are involved in the process are still heavily involved in. And I think that might be one place for things to kind of start looking different. I'm not sure if that self-report research that they're anticipating is going to be participatory research, but at least there's an attempt to kind of move in that direction. And I haven't really looked at 5.1 yet. I'm curious to see what's going on with the personality disorders.
Walter, you want to join us online? Walter, wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for a great talk, and thank you for having these be hybrid. It's really helpful to be able to attend. So my question was, you mentioned briefly that you'd be for a sort of return to the cognitive, to incorporating psychiatry with the kinds of models that the cognitive revolution or the cognitive turn could have provided. And I was wondering if there are any specific attempts or frameworks that you're thinking about in that respect. So, one of the things that comes to mind is, work within predictive processing or maybe active inference, something like what Paul Fletcher is doing at Cambridge or Phil Collette at Yale. And I was just wondering what you think about those kinds of attempts, and also whether there are any others that you're excited to see, where they go in that respect. Thanks.
Thank you. The question is, well,
I
guess I don't have to repeat it because this is the one I don't repeat. God. Okay, so that's a great question, and I don't know if I look at somewhere, but so my favorite cognitive revolutionist to turn to is Ulrich Neisser. He has written extensively on he's a psychologist. He was one of the kind of founders or the front runners of cognitive revolution. He has written on the self, and his account of the self was closer to, of course, a psychologist's account of the self, not the metaphysical, philosophical kind of self. And in that, he kind of talks about the self in a kind of self-knowledge, at least in an empirically tractable manner, by talking about different forms of self-knowledge. So in my book, I'm developing that account of the self and in the context of psychiatry and what that would mean for psychiatric research as a research target. But it's actually heartening to see some other like computational models, for instance, in thinking about mental disorders, like symptom networks, like network models. I think there's interesting psychological and philosophical work being done that kind of tries to reignite cognitive revolution in different senses. We only need psychiatrists to listen to us. Thank you.
Ravi, you're gonna have the last question. Go for it. Short one.
Okay. I feel pressure. Okay. My question is about analogies with physical disorders. So kind of going along some of the themes that already came up. And I think we already talked about this in the past, but I'm still kind of wondering whether some kind of similar arguments were made in the physical cases, like whether it's pain management or like whatever other diseases. I wonder, you described this chasm between the academic literature and maybe practitioners, and I wonder if there's anything similar outside of psychiatry, like physical medicine, or if there's been something like that in the past, and if so, is there anything we could learn about how they may have succeeded or failed to bridge that gap that we could take and apply to psychiatry?
That's a great question. So, and I can say a lot about this in also my role as a director of a medical humanities program. In other areas of medicine, so narrative medicine is big now, right? And narrative medicine aims to, I mean, again, it's very broad, but like broadly, it kind of promotes engaging and dealing and responding to and addressing patients' narratives in clinical treatment process. So a lot of that is kind of about like how to talk to patients, how to display empathy, and so on and so forth. But you know, people like Rita Sharon, who's the founder of narrative medicine, talks about how what patients teach to doctors and clinicians and so on. And their examples tend to be all actually like non-psychiatric examples, cancer treatment, you know, other forms of like physical disabilities and so on and so forth. So, and I think there's a sense in which that psychiatry is even behind the times of other areas of medicine. Like, you know, when the medical model was on the rise in the 1970s, like psychiatry was trying to establish itself, like we are a legitimate area, branch of medicine, like we are scientific, but in some sense, like other areas in medicine kind of moved and they have more expansive epistemologies in thinking about illnesses than like psychiatry itself. And psychiatry kind of like somewhere stuck between like behaviorism and neuroscience. So I think there are different examples that we can kind of turn to in philosophy of medicine, medical epistemology, and other areas of medicine as well.
Nice, thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
For his conference, and if not, Tuesday next week for Ravi's.
I have one already. I feel like I'm double dipping.
It's all right. It's all right.
But it's like,
What you had was a few years ago.
yeah, 10 years ago. So it marks from postdoc. No, it's not. Yeah, yeah. It's from my postdoc.